If the system hadn't malfunctioned, I would have been on board. If the cashier at the airport hadn't mixed up my ticket, I would have been among them. If I hadn't stayed at the airport, I would never have known that this event was not an accident. They called it an accident. But what if that plane wasn't supposed to land? What if those who left the plane disappeared without a trace? And now, it looks like I'm next. Keanu Reeves arrived at the airport in Washington, D.C., feeling the usual quiet solitude that accompanied his travels. He wasn't a man who enjoyed unnecessary attention, preferring to slip through the world unnoticed when he wasn't on set. The flight was supposed to be routine, another short hop from one city to another, a brief interlude before his next project. As he made his way toward the boarding gate, something felt slightly off. Maybe it was the way the attendant looked at his ticket, pausing just a fraction too long before scanning it. Or perhaps it was the subtle tension in the air. When she finally spoke, it was with an apologetic tone. "Mr. Reeves, I'm terribly sorry, but there seems to be an issue with your ticket." He arched a brow, but remained calm. "Issue?" "Yes, sir. It appears that your seat was reassigned." "That's odd. I booked this flight weeks ago." The attendant glanced at the screen again, tapping a few keys with increasing concern. "It seems the system has overbooked the flight, and your seat was reassigned to another passenger." Keanu inhaled deeply, nodding. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened to him. It was an inconvenience, nothing more. He was a patient man, and there were always alternate flights. He stepped aside, allowing the process to continue while he checked his phone for another itinerary. He decided to wait at a nearby cafe inside the terminal, sipping on a lukewarm coffee and watching the other passengers as they boarded Flight 5342. He noticed them, though he didn't know any of them personally. A mix of business travelers, families, and a few uniformed personnel, likely military. There was also a man in a dark suit, tall and rigid, who walked with an air of quiet authority. He moved differently, like someone with a purpose beyond catching a plane. Reeves had spent enough time around professionals in his career to recognize a certain posture, a level of trained movement. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just another traveler. Keanu leaned back in his chair, letting the moment pass. He had no reason to care. The flight taxied onto the runway, engines roaring into motion, and within minutes, the plane lifted off into the gray sky. Then, barely 20 minutes later, everything changed. The first thing he noticed was the shift in tone around the airport. It was subtle at first, an increase in activity near the security desks, hushed conversations between staff. Then came the alerts on the news monitors scattered throughout the terminal. Breaking news: Flight 5342 has gone down over the Potomac River. Cause unknown. Rescue operations underway. Asterisk asterisk. Keanu's body tensed instinctively. The very flight he had been scheduled to board had met disaster within moments of departure. He felt a strange, hollow sensation in his chest, disbelief, relief, and a creeping sense that something wasn't right. His first instinct was to check for updates, searching for information that would clarify what had happened. Initial reports claimed a mid-air collision, an accident involving a military Black Hawk helicopter. But as more details emerged, inconsistencies began to appear. The helicopter wasn't supposed to be in that airspace. The plane had deviated slightly from its expected route minutes before the incident. And then there was the fact that the list of confirmed passengers was still being updated. Some names appeared, then disappeared. Keanu wasn't the type to chase conspiracies, but he trusted his instincts. The more he read, the more something gnawed at the edges of his perception. A few hours later, he found himself scrolling through social media, reading real-time updates from journalists, passengers' families, and aviation experts speculating about the incident. A pattern began to form. Certain individuals on board were of particular interest: government officials, defense contractors, intelligence analysts. It wasn't just an ordinary passenger list. Then came the most disturbing discovery. There were unconfirmed reports of survivors. Not many, just two. They had made it out of the wreckage before emergency teams arrived. But no one knew where they had gone. This was where things took a turn. The news was only reporting total losses, no mention of any survivors. But Keanu had come across multiple first-hand accounts from witnesses near the crash site, claiming they saw people moving away from the wreckage, not toward it. He hesitated for a long moment, considering his next move. There was nothing tying him to this event, He had simply been one seat away from being on that plane, but something deep inside urged him forward. If he hadn't been stopped from boarding, would he have disappeared too? Would his name have flickered in and out of the passenger list? Curiosity became determination. He decided to dig deeper. Keanu began making calls, reaching out to people he trusted, industry connections, former colleagues who had served in law enforcement or the military. Most of them knew nothing beyond what had been reported, but a former intelligence officer, now retired, listened to his story in silence before finally speaking. "You weren't supposed to be on that flight." Keanu stiffened. "What do you mean?" "There's something off about this whole thing. If what you're telling me is true, you might have just stepped out of something big. I'd advise you to leave it alone." Keanu frowned. That was the last thing he was going to do. Later that night, he sat in his hotel room, surrounded by scattered notes, open browser tabs, and printed news articles. He had mapped out every inconsistency, every strange deviation in the story. It led to one question. Why were those survivors missing? A knock at his door made him freeze. He hadn't ordered room service. He hadn't expected anyone. He approached cautiously, looking through the peephole. A man in a dark suit stood outside, his expression unreadable. Keanu didn't open the door. Another knock, more insistent this time. "Mr. Reeves," the man finally said, voice calm and measured. "We need to talk." Keanu took a slow breath, steeling himself. Something told him this was only the beginning. Keanu Reeves stood motionless behind the door, his mind racing. The man outside had knocked twice, his voice controlled, calm, but carrying a weight that suggested he wasn't about to leave without an answer. Something about the tone, the confidence, made Keanu uneasy. Years in the industry had given him an instinct for reading people, and this man wasn't just another journalist or fan. He took a step back, inhaling deeply as he weighed his options. Whoever this was, he had found Keanu's hotel room easily, too easily. That alone suggested that he wasn't working alone. Someone had been keeping track of him. And if they were knocking now, it meant they were either giving him a warning or trying to contain something before it spiraled out of control. Keanu wasn't about to open the door. Instead, he quietly reached for his phone, searching for the number of his contact, the intelligence officer he had spoken to earlier. Before he could dial, another knock, this time firmer, more deliberate. "Mr. Reeves, please. Just a moment of your time." No, he wasn't going to give them that moment. Keanu pressed a button on his phone, sending a quick message to his contact with just one word. "Watching?" Then he moved toward the window. His hotel room was on the 10th floor, too high to climb down, but the fire escape was just to the right. If he could just... A noise from outside the door made him freeze. The handle was moving. Whoever this was, they weren't waiting for an invitation anymore. Keanu acted fast. He crossed the room in 2 steps, grabbing his jacket and bag. If they were coming in, he needed to be out. The window lock clicked open beneath his fingers, and he swung it outward, feeling the cool night air rush in. His pulse pounded as he hoisted himself through, gripping the metal frame of the fire escape. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than staying inside. A muffled sound, a scuffle of feet inside the room. They were in. Keanu didn't look back. He climbed down quickly, the fire escape rattling under his weight. At the 8th floor, he swung himself over a railing onto a balcony, crouching behind the barrier just as the hotel room door above burst open. He could hear them moving inside, their footsteps purposeful, checking every corner. Then the voice again. "He's not here." Another voice, lower, sharper. "Find him." Keanu remained still, controlling his breathing. He didn't know how many of them there were, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about asking questions. They had come prepared, expecting resistance. That meant he was now a target, and whatever was behind the crash of Flight 5342, it wasn't something the world was supposed to uncover. After a few minutes, the noises from above faded. Keanu stayed where he was, waiting longer than necessary just to be sure. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he climbed down the final levels of the fire escape and slipped into the alley behind the hotel. His contact finally responded yes. "Get out. Not safe. Asterisk, asterisk." That was all he needed to see. Keanu disappeared into the city, knowing he had just stepped into something far bigger than he had imagined. Now, it wasn't just about curiosity. Now, it was about survival. The next morning, the news was flooded with new developments about the crash. Officials were still not releasing all the passenger names. And now there was a new wrinkle. The Pentagon had taken over the investigation. Keanu sat in a dimly lit diner, hood pulled low over his head, staring at his coffee. His contact had agreed to meet, but only under specific conditions. No phones, no tracing, no direct routes. That alone told Keanu that he had been right. This wasn't just an accident. When the door to the diner opened, he didn't turn immediately. Instead, he waited for the man to slide into the booth across from him. Talk, Keanu said simply. The man, an ex-intelligence officer named Barrett, sighed. You should have walked away. Too late. Barrett rubbed a hand over his face, clearly uneasy. Flight 5342 wasn't just a commercial flight. There were people on that plane who weren't supposed to be there. People with knowledge of something big. And now they're gone. Keanu leaned forward. And the ones who got out? Barrett exhaled. No one knows. Or at least, no one's admitting they do. Keanu tapped a finger against the table, thinking. The ones who had survived had been taken. That much was clear. But why? What were they trying to hide? Before he could ask another question, Barrett's eyes shifted toward the window. His whole body tensed. We need to leave. Now. Keanu didn't ask why. He had learned to trust instincts, and right now, Barrett's instincts were screaming. He threw a few bills on the table and followed the man out the back entrance. As they stepped into the alley, Keanu finally turned. What did you see? Barrett's jaw tightened. We're not the only ones looking for answers. Keanu nodded once. Then, without another word, they vanished into the streets, knowing the hunt had only just begun. The streets of Washington, D.C. buzzed with their usual morning rhythm, but for Keanu and Barrett, every shadow seemed like a potential threat. They moved quickly, but without drawing attention, slipping into side alleys, avoiding security cameras, and keeping their heads down. Barrett led the way, his years of experience and intelligence guiding them through the labyrinth of streets. He didn't speak much, only giving short directives when necessary. Keanu, naturally aware of movement and rhythm from years in the industry, matched his pace and instincts. After a few blocks, they reached a narrow underground parking structure. Barrett checked over his shoulder before guiding Keanu toward an older, nondescript sedan. The car was unremarkable. No plates, no identifiers. A perfect ghost vehicle. We need to be gone before they start tracking, Barrett muttered, unlocking the doors. Get in. Keanu slid into the passenger seat, adjusting his hoodie as he did. How bad is this? Barrett started the engine and pulled onto a back street. Worse than we thought. Keanu waited for more, but Barrett was focused, his hands tight on the wheel. After a few minutes of silence, he finally spoke. You were never supposed to be on that flight, but now you've seen too much. The people who pulled those survivors from the wreckage aren't law enforcement, and they sure as hell aren't first responders. Then who are they? Barrett exhaled, checking the rear-view mirror. Private contractors. Think paramilitary, but off the books. Black-budget operations. They clean up messes before the public ever sees them. Keanu absorbed the information, piecing together the implications. So they weren't saving people. They were containing them. Exactly. The car wove through traffic, staying below the radar. Barrett reached into the center console, pulling out a manila folder. He handed it to Keanu without a word. Inside were grainy surveillance photos, taken from a distance. They showed figures in tactical gear moving what looked like bodies from the water's edge into black, unmarked SUVs. Another image showed a man, soaking wet and seemingly injured, being forced into the back of one of the vehicles. His face was partially obscured, but Keanu could tell he was terrified. No official reports mention these people, Barrett said. They've been erased. Keanu studied the photos. Who were they? Barrett tightened his grip on the wheel. That's what we need to find out. They drove for hours, eventually leaving the city limits. Barrett had arranged a safe house, a small cabin tucked away in the woods, miles from any major roads. It was stocked with supplies, an emergency generator, and most importantly, no electronic devices that could be traced. Once inside, Keanu finally let himself exhale. So, what's next? Barrett sat down at the small wooden table, rubbing his temples. We need to find out who those people were and why they were taken. Keanu leaned against the counter. Do you have names? Barrett nodded, pulling out another document. 2 names popped up in the passenger list. Both had government ties. One was a whistleblower scheduled to testify in front of a closed congressional committee. Keanu frowned. And the other? A scientist. High-level clearance. Worked on something classified. The room fell into silence. Keanu rubbed his jaw. What was the scientist working on? Barrett hesitated. That's where things get messy. I don't have specifics, but the project involved biometric data collection and advanced AI surveillance. Keanu's stomach tightened. So, we're talking about something big. Very. The next few hours were spent dissecting the limited information they had. Keanu knew this wasn't just about curiosity anymore. This was a full-blown cover-up. Barrett tapped a folder. There's one last lead. Keanu raised an eyebrow. And a witness. He pulled out a grainy still frame from security footage. A woman, mid-30s, was captured in the background, watching as the black SUVs pulled away. She had managed to avoid being taken, but she had seen everything. She's in hiding, Barrett said. And if we don't get to her first, they will. Keanu nodded. Then we find her. Tracking the woman wasn't easy. She had gone completely off-grid. No digital footprint, no social media, no credit card transactions. She was either extremely careful or someone had helped her disappear. Barrett finally traced a lead to a remote motel 2 states away. A place where people checked in under fake names and paid in cash. They drove through the night, taking turns at the wheel. When they finally reached the rundown motel, the air was thick with tension. This could be a trap, Keanu said quietly. Barrett nodded. That's why we go in carefully. They parked a block away, approaching on foot. The motel was dimly lit, the neon sign flickering. Keanu scanned the parking lot. 2 cars, no signs of immediate movement. Barrett led the way to room 6B. He knocked once lightly. No answer. He knocked again. A faint rustling from inside. Barrett took a step back. She's in there. Keanu pressed closer, lowering his voice. We're not here to hurt you. We just want to talk. A long silence. Then, slowly the door cracked open. A woman peeked out, her eyes scanning them. Then, recognition flickered in her face as she looked at Keanu. Wait, you're... Keanu held up a hand. Yeah, but that's not why we're here. She hesitated, then opened the door just wide enough for them to enter. Once inside, she locked it behind them, quickly pulling the curtains shut. She looked shaken but determined. You don't know what you've stepped into. Keanu met her gaze. Then tell us. She swallowed hard. They're not just hiding survivors. Barrett leaned in. What do you mean? Her voice dropped to a whisper. They weren't supposed to survive. The room fell into silence. Keanu exhaled slowly. Then we have even bigger problems than we thought. The tension inside the motel room was palpable. The woman, her face partially illuminated by the dim light from the bedside lamp, moved with caution. Every action was deliberate, every breath controlled, as though she had trained herself to be invisible. Keanu observed her carefully, noticing the subtle tremors in her fingers as she rearranged the objects on the small wooden table. It wasn't fear, it was exhaustion, the kind that came from being hunted for too long. Barrett stood near the window, shifting the curtains just enough to scan the parking lot outside. He didn't speak, but the weight in his posture suggested he didn't like what he saw. The woman, still adjusting to their presence, sat down but kept her back close to the wall. Keanu remained standing, feeling the pulse of the room as the reality of their situation settled in. She was the only known witness, the only loose thread in a carefully woven cover-up, the only person who had seen what happened to the survivors before they vanished. And now, she was trapped in this rundown motel with 2 men she didn't know if she could trust. Outside, the street was silent, but it was the kind of silence that felt unnatural. The hum of distant traffic was absent, as though the city itself was waiting for something to happen. The woman, shifting her weight uncomfortably, finally exhaled deeply and reached for a notepad. Her voice was too hoarse to speak freely, and instead, she wrote in quick, deliberate strokes. Asterisk, they weren't just taken. They were expected. Asterisk. Keanu's eyes scanned the words. The simplicity of the statement made it even more unsettling. Expected. Not rescued, not detained, expected. As though their fates had already been decided before the crash even happened. Barrett turned from the window, his expression darkening. He had seen enough in his years to recognize an operation that was bigger than any of them. His silence confirmed what they already knew. This wasn't just an accident. It wasn't a series of unfortunate coincidences. It was something controlled, planned. The woman continued writing, flipping to a fresh page. Asterisk, they weren't supposed to survive. But two did. And now they are nowhere. Asterisk. Keanu let out a slow breath. Every new detail they uncovered led to more questions, but none brought them closer to the truth. Two survivors. Now missing. The official reports omitted this, meaning the people in charge were either involved or covering for those who were. Barrett ran a hand over his face and reached for a small map from his pocket. He unfolded it on the table, tapping twice on a location circled in red. "We need to check here," he said finally. His voice was quiet, but the urgency in it was impossible to miss. The woman hesitated before nodding. She seemed reluctant, but there was no other option left. They couldn't stay here, not when every minute increased the likelihood that they had already been found. Keanu folded the map, slipped it into his jacket, and gave a final glance toward the door. They had one night, one shot to find answers before the people responsible erased every last trace of the truth. The night stretched on as Keanu, Barrett, and the woman moved through the back streets, avoiding open areas where they could be spotted. Every step was measured, every movement calculated. The air was thick with tension, the silence around them unnatural. It felt as though they were being watched, but each time they checked, there was nothing. Only the eerie quiet of a city that should have been alive with sound. Their destination was an abandoned facility, one that had long since been forgotten by the city. Barrett had marked it on the map for a reason. It had once been a research site for classified projects, a place where information was stored before it was erased from public records. If there was anything left about the missing passengers, it would be there. The building loomed ahead, its structure worn down by time and neglect. The windows were boarded up, the entrance secured by rusted chains that had long lost their strength. Keanu went first, slipping through a broken section of the fence while Barrett followed, scanning the area. The woman hesitated before stepping inside, her hands tightening into fists as though bracing herself for what they might find. Inside, the facility was exactly as they expected. Cold, empty, filled with remnants of something long abandoned. Dust coated the surfaces, and the air carried the scent of decay. There were no signs of life, no evidence of recent use, yet something felt off. The energy in the room was heavy, as though the past still lingered in the air. Keanu moved toward the control panel, brushing away debris to reveal a network of switches and inactive monitors. Barrett scanned the walls, searching for hidden storage units, while the woman knelt near a pile of discarded files. Her hands moved quickly, flipping through pages that had been left behind, eyes darting over faded words and incomplete reports. The deeper they went, the more unsettling the discoveries became. References to experimental tracking systems, biometric data collection, and remote surveillance operations painted a picture of something far more complex than a simple accident. Keanu found an old terminal, the screen flickering weakly as he powered it up. It took time, but eventually, fragments of data appeared, a partial flight manifest, a classified authorization code, and a name that sent a chill down his spine. One of the missing passengers had been here before. The realization settled over them like a weight. This wasn't just about the crash. This was about control, about people who had been marked long before they stepped on that plane. The passengers had never been ordinary civilians. They had been targets. And the accident had never been an accident at all. Barrett exhaled sharply, stepping back as the implications sank in. The woman tightened her grip on the file she held, her knuckles turning white. Keanu simply stared at the screen, his mind racing through the possibilities. They had come looking for answers, and now they had them. But the truth was darker than they could have ever imagined. A sound echoed through the building, distant but unmistakable. Footsteps. Someone else was here. Their time had run out.